Welcome to Shift Happens, the podcast where we talk about energy, tech, leadership, and large scale projects, where sometimes, let's be honest, not everything goes according to plan. My name is Manuel.
And my name is Dirk. And together we both talk about topics that we regard as interesting, challenging in the wide world of energy developments.
So, today we're going to talk about everything related to hydrogen. First of all, we want to talk about why does it really matter and what are the different types of hydrogen, like the different colors of hydrogen. Then we're going to focus on what's the difference between the different types of hydrogen in terms of price and production. And ultimately, we're going to talk about what's the demand, focusing on Europe. What do we really need in terms of hydrogen? What kind of quantities do we really need?
So when we talk about hydrogen in the wider context, we talk about something that helps us with low carbon solutions for the industry in general, for energy demand. There's a lot of development on policies, on initiatives to sort of enable the supply for hydrogen and also to develop the demand on the other hand. We deal a lot with how to build the actual infrastructure to have that solution ready for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it makes sense to start at the very basics first. Why does hydrogen really matter and what's the whole discussion all about? I think, first of all, what you can say is that hydrogen is currently used mainly in industries for chemical processes, for example. But there is another use, which is the use for energy. So you can use hydrogen to generate energy. And it's actually by burning hydrogen, it's a quite clean way of generating energy because what actually happens when you burn hydrogen is you generate energy and water. So there is no CO2 emissions or anything coming out. The second very interesting point in hydrogen is compared to, for example, to wind parks, is that hydrogen can be produced and then can be transported to any point in the world via ships or pipelines or whatever there is. So there is a attractiveness to hydrogen that you can produce it in somewhere else and then you can bring it to Europe, for example, and use the energy here. This is not really possible for energy sources like wind farms or photovoltaic because the electricity needs to be produced in the vicinity of where it's actually needed.
Yeah. Okay, so hydrogen is a substance, a molecule that would look the same everywhere else. But we introduced the name of colors earlier. So hydrogen comes in different types, how they are generated, and they are usually attributed with a color to keep them easily apart. So there's, I think, three main types of hydrogen that are currently generated and some accessory other exotic types that are not produced in big amounts at the moment. So the main amount of hydrogen at the moment is produced during natural gas processing. It's called then the gray hydrogen. Also, the color is also saying that it's not the most desired type of hydrogen for future use. So we said it comes by natural gas processing. It is abundant, therefore, still because we still process a lot of natural gas in the industry. Another type is blue hydrogen. That is then when you have the gray hydrogen combined with any solution to get rid of the CO2 that is generated when you burn natural gas, when you transform natural gas, where you produce carbon dioxide. So this is then either utilized or being transferred to storage, normally into a subsurface storage. And the last of the key hydrogen types is the green hydrogen. That's sort of the most desired type, which is hydrogen that is generated through electrolyzers, and they are run by renewable energy, so mostly from photovoltaics and wind energy.
Yeah, exactly. Just to summarize it, maybe from my understanding. So you have green and blue hydrogen, which is in a similar process in the generation of hydrogen, whereas the gray version does not get rid of the CO2 that is produced during the process. Whereas with blue hydrogen, you are adding the technology of carbon capture and storage. So you're storing the CO2 that is produced in an underground storage. Now, this has an advantage because then you are more low carbon emission. And then there's the third, the big one, which is green hydrogen, which is obviously carbon neutral because you're generating hydrogen using renewable energy and a different process. Just for completeness, as you said, there are some exotic colors. There is additionally is turquoise hydrogen. Turquoise hydrogen is the generation of hydrogen using natural gas, but with a different method, which is methane pyrolysis. The advantage of this is that you generate H2, hydrogen, and solid carbon. So there is no carbon dioxide coming out of the process. You're dealing with a solid carbon result. Then there is pink and purple hydrogen. There are different processes in the generation of hydrogen, but the main common denominator is that the energy source is nuclear energy. And the last one, just for completeness, is orange hydrogen, which is natural occurring hydrogen on the Earth. So there are occasions where hydrogen appears in a natural way on Earth, and obviously you could use this hydrogen as well. So this is for the completeness. Now we have talked about all the different types and colors and everything. So why does this really matter? I mean, we just talked about it, that there are different processes on how this hydrogen is generated. In the end result of hydrogen is all the same. So the molecule hydrogen is the same. But some of them have advantages in terms of CO2 emissions, like green hydrogen being completely CO2 neutral, where gray hydrogen, for example, is highly CO2 intensive, blue hydrogen somewhere in the middle. And the second point that is actually relevant is the production costs. So when you look into different types of hydrogen, you can end up with the same molecule, but to a completely different price point because of the way you are producing the hydrogen.
Yeah. And that's the point that will actually matter how you can install hydrogen as a solution in the short or the long run. So, okay, um, let's talk a bit more detail about hydrogen. And when we talk about hydrogen, I guess we also need to compare it to sort of the common known energy sources that we have. We not don't talk about coal or oil. Let's talk about natural gas as a comparison because that is the energy source that comes a bit close to what hydrogen actually is.
Yeah, exactly. So when we try to compare these different types of energy sources, let's put it that way, I think there are three main components we need to look at. As we discussed already, it's obviously a matter of price. So how much does it actually cost to produce one unit of energy source in terms of mass, let's say kilograms? The second is how much CO2 emissions does 1 kilo of this energy source actually produce? So when you burn hydrogen or when you burn natural gas, how much CO2 do you actually produce? And the third component, which is very important to understand, is what's the energy density of these different energy types? Because as we already said, hydrogen has a very high energy density. And actually compared to natural gas, the energy density is like twice as much. So that means that by burning 1 kilogram of hydrogen, you can generate twice as much energy than by burning 1 kilogram of natural gas. This is important because when you try to calculate like how much do you need, how much do you need to burn, how much does it actually cost you, and how much CO2 are you producing in the end, you need to consider how much mass you actually need to burn. Now, we talked about the energy density. So the energy density of hydrogen is twice as much. So you need to burn half of it. But how much CO2 emissions do you actually produce when you burn 1 kilogram of these individual units? So just as a reference point, natural gas, when you burn it, you usually produce 2.75 kilograms of CO2 emissions by burning 1 kilogram of natural gas. Now, as we already mentioned, it makes a difference now in terms of what kind of hydrogen you're actually referring to, because the different types of hydrogen produce a different amount of CO2. If we take now as a reference gray hydrogen, which is currently mainly used for satisfying the demand, gray hydrogen actually produces way more CO2 emissions than burning natural gas. It's in the magnitude of 2 to 3 times more than it is, which somehow makes sense because gray hydrogen uses natural gas as a source, and you process the source to generate hydrogen, which then results in more CO2 emissions. Now, when we look into blue hydrogen, which is essentially gray hydrogen, but you capture the CO2 in the process and you store it, there are actually massive advantages in the terms of CO2 emissions. Because you capture the CO2 along the way and you store it away, you can actually reduce the CO2 that is produced to a third of when you're burning natural gas. So this is a substantial step down from gray hydrogen to blue hydrogen. And obviously, as a last step, the green hydrogen, which is the most clean version of it, uh, in theory, produces zero CO2 emissions. So, in terms of sustainability and environmental impact, this is the energy source you would really like to have on the market.
So, okay, that was physics. So let's talk about economics. We always talk now about these three different types of hydrogen. They come at a certain cost, I assume. And what I hear as well, the most desired type of hydrogen, green hydrogen, certainly is a uh, challenging thing to follow up with.
Yeah. So what we said so far is only half of the story, obviously. So we need to look at the flip side of the coin, which is obviously production costs. And unfortunately, at the current state, the ranking in terms of hydrogen is exactly the opposite. So gray hydrogen is the cheapest way of producing hydrogen with average of production costs of $2 per kilograms. It's the cheapest version. If you compare this with green hydrogen, which is the most desired, we're currently averaging in the range of $6 per kilograms. So it's 3 times the price to produce a unit of green hydrogen versus a unit of gray hydrogen. Looking at blue hydrogen, it's very interesting. Blue hydrogen somewhere lands in the middle with production costs of $3 per unit. So when you look into blue hydrogen, you have a comparably cheap way of producing hydrogen and a comparably good way of in terms of CO2 emissions. So it's a good middle ground, actually better than the middle ground. It's a good alternative to produce hydrogen relatively cheaply with a very low carbon footprint.
Yeah. So I can imagine that um, in order to make this work and to generate the amounts that are needed, so the easiest, not the cheapest, but the easiest solution is probably the one that could be most promising to follow up.
Yeah, in particularly in countries where infrastructure is already existing. And I think this is where the debate now starts also in Europe. And some countries in Europe, like Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands, are already looking into these opportunities because there's infrastructure existing and there's also storage capacity existing. So you have already facilities in place where you could theoretically produce hydrogen, gray hydrogen, and then make it blue hydrogen, so to say, capture the CO2 and then store it in storage capacity that is available. And also pipeline and storage infrastructure or platforms to store the CO2 are available. So there's not too much of an upfront heavy investment that would need to be done in these kind of countries.
But ultimately, on the long run, the green hydrogen is actually the target to achieve. Um, but for that, I hear we're still having a big step to make in order to generate the infrastructure or even the right size, the right amount of production facilities to bring this to the market.
Exactly. So, I mean, green hydrogen is obviously the best solution, as we just discussed. But I think the main challenge with green hydrogen in itself is there's not that much of facilities currently existing, and the capacities of these facilities worldwide is not big enough.
Yeah.
I think you can talk about it. There is a big facility now in the planning in Saudi Arabia, for example, which is supposed to be one of the biggest green hydrogen units in the world. And in Europe, there's not much going on in terms of green hydrogen currently. So there, if you really want to talk about hydrogen seriously, you either need to pick up the investments to produce green hydrogen on a large scale, but we need to talk about what this really means. Or you need to think about alternatives or transition technologies where blue hydrogen really could fit.
Yeah. Well, certainly blue hydrogen tech in Europe is something also in the overall development discussion of carbon capture, storage, carbon capture and utilization. These are the technologies that are strongly developed at the moment. But in order looking to the future of green hydrogen, there you need to generate a certain mass. You gave that example from Saudi Arabia, where in the vicinity of this planned gigantic new city, Neom. There's actually a big electrolyzer unit to be started. This is billions of investment, yeah, and this is targeted to produce 600 tons of hydrogen per day that then will be transformed into ammonia. We would get to that, what ammonia actually is in the end, to make it sort of easier to transport to any customer there. But this is a huge project. This is a huge endeavor. And we would need to obviously also to set these, for example, 600 tons per day into a relation to what actually demands and needs will be in the end. Yeah, specifically also in Europe, if we would say, yeah, green hydrogen is the future, we need to do this, this, and this in order to get it.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a very good transition for the next point. I think we discussed now a little bit about production costs, what are the technical limitations, and what can you do in terms of production. Now, we have said there are facilities producing that and that amount of hydrogen, but what does this really mean? And I think for this, we need to understand what is the actual demand of hydrogen, what is hydrogen used for, and what's the actually the demand, and what's the forecasted demand of, let's say, Europe or then maybe Germany. But maybe we focus on Europe first. Maybe we can talk about this in the next step.
So let's focus on Europe because Europe has ambitions in that domain, in that respect. Currently, Europe produces around 7.5 million tons of hydrogen per year. 80% of that is actually not used for energy production, power supply. It's used as an industrial feedstock, like material for the chemical industry. And the biggest part of that is actually gray hydrogen. So the hydrogen that has the highest CO2 footprint, hydrogen without any CO2 solution at this point in time. Um, the ambitions are there. Europe by 2030 wants to produce 20 million tons of hydrogen from renewable sources. That's the ambition. But if you dig a little bit deeper in directives which are published, this is only about 10% of these ambitions where you can really say, oh, we make an obligation out of this. Yeah? So there's a big gap already there between ambition and foreseeable reality. That's on a European level. You can also look on country level. Yeah, in Germany, there are forecasts that Germany by 2030 has a demand of around 130 terawatt hours of power energy generated by hydrogen. Um, that is just a big number in the end. That is 1/5 of the total power generation in Germany as we have it today. But I think we need to go even a little bit deeper to find a good example in order to break things down more because the numbers are just too big.
Yeah, yeah, I think, and this is sometimes for me, it's the challenge. If you hear all about these big numbers, it's really difficult to relate. But I think what I get out of your message, at least, is that there are quite ambitious targets in Europe. And I think to a degree, almost over ambitious. So I think that at least I have the feeling that Europe is already lacking behind to achieve these ambitions for 2030, for example, 20 million tons of green hydrogen to be used in Europe. I think that seems a little bit far off. But um, for me, it sometimes really makes sense to, break down the numbers a little bit more into tangible sizes. And for that purpose, I thought of a thought experiment, let's put it that way. So, what would it theoretically mean if you would run a large size city? Like, let's take Berlin, for example, since we're here in Germany right now. What would it mean to run such a city on, let's say, hydrogen, purely hydrogen? As I said, a thought experiment, but sometimes it helps. So, Berlin is a large city, 4 million inhabitants. To run such a city, and we are currently talking about to run heating, to run electricity, to run transport, you would theoretically need something around 100 terawatt hours to run a city the whole year. Let's put it that way. So 100 terawatt hours per year. Now, to run this city in with hydrogen, you would need roughly around 3 million tons of hydrogen per year to run the city for the whole year. To compare it with natural gas, you would need around 7 million tons of natural gas to run Berlin, so to say. This is obviously because of the different energy density. We talked about this, and this is why it is important to consider it. So you need more than twice of the tons of natural gas to run the same city for 1 year. Now, what does it mean in terms of CO2 footprint? If you would run the city on natural gas, you would produce around 20 million tons CO2 per year, which is quite a lot, in my opinion. Now, if you would run the same city on green hydrogen, for example, you would obviously purely green hydrogen, you would produce zero CO2 emissions. Quite theoretical, but in theory, this would be the case. Now, if you would run it on blue hydrogen, which is a reasonable, more realistic solution, let's put it that way, you would actually produce something in the range of 2.5 million tons of CO2 per year. So this is a significant reduction of running a city compared to in natural gas. Now, as we discussed before, this obviously comes with a price. If you would run the city on natural gas, we are talking about something like $4.2 billion a year to run it on natural gas purely.
It's already a number.
That's already a big number, but the numbers are getting bigger and bigger. If you would run it on blue hydrogen, we are talking about twice as much. We are talking about 9.5 billion tons US dollars per year. And if we would go for green hydrogen with the current technical solutions, we are actually in a range of $17 billion per year. Now, these are very big numbers, but I think at least with numbers in terms of money, people can understand what's going on. Now, obviously, this is a very theoretical example. You would never ever run a whole city just with one energy source or something, but just to get a little bit of an understanding, what does it really mean? So if you really compare like natural gas prices versus green hydrogen prices, we are talking in a magnitude of times four. So for every energy unit you want to produce with green hydrogen, you have 4 times the price at the current state. And this is a lot. Now, as a country, as Europe, or as a country, or even as a region within Germany, you need to think about a reasonable energy mix. Because, I mean, I think it's quite clear that you cannot rely on just one energy source. You need to find a suitable mix that balances off prices, reliability of the energy source, and of course, the CO2 footprint. Now, this is a discussion that needs to be done, and where we should think about when we talk about legislations and constraints in terms of energy sources.
Yeah. Yeah, as you say, right, you would not run any entity on one energy source completely alone. Um, that's certainly clear, but the sort of the dimension, yeah, ambition becomes clearer when you compare all these numbers in the end. Yeah. So yeah, what does it actually then really take in order to go into that direction? Because the direction to some degree is set. Yeah. Um, the far target is green hydrogen, and there are solutions in between. How do we get there actually? And you already mentioned policies. We have a lot of initiatives. Not all of them actually survived the initial stages. What does it really take in order to get into that direction? So let's talk about the challenges that we actually face in order to make this a business, to get hydrogen rolling. Yeah? Um, you would normally have a balance of supply and demand that you have in an open market, in a functioning market situation. At the moment, we have policy dictating or demanding that industry is using a certain percentage at a certain point in the future as supply from renewable hydrogen. Um, that is the one thing to generate any demand to get things rolling. On the supply side, that actually needs then infrastructure, needs investments in infrastructure. That, and we talked about that. That is the challenge to follow up with that in the end, to find investors that bring the money to the table to invest in production and transport of the material. We had the example of the Saudi plant earlier. It's a multi-billion investment there. And there, apart from the amount of money that you need to put on the table to build it, uh, the decisive cost in the end, the decisive factor is how much do you pay for the power to run it. Yeah? And that should come from renewable energy. And there we talk about 1.5 cent per kilowatt hour. These are not the prices that we see at the moment in Europe.
Yeah, and exactly that's the point. So I think when we talk about creating supply and demand, it's in the end it's all about prices. So you will not generate a demand of a resource that is way more expensive than alternatives. And as you just mentioned, currently this is a little bit enforced by legislation, so companies need to really take it. But I mean, realistically speaking, if you want to create a green hydrogen market, you have to offer it at a competitive price. And this comes with challenges, as we just stated. So technology really needs to pick up, and the main driver there is electricity prices. Because just imagine if you, even as a regular person, if you would go with your hydrogen car now to a gas station and you would be offered green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, which is literally the same thing, but you would pay 4 times as much for the green hydrogen to fill your car versus blue hydrogen. I think it's quite obvious for many people which kind of alternatives they would take. And companies, in a way, function the same. If you get the same product for a cheaper price, you would obviously move towards that direction rather than going to green hydrogen.
Yeah. Okay, coming to the next point is then talking about infrastructure. Well, we had the supplier before. We had an example on how much effort you have actually, how much you need to invest to produce hydrogen, specifically green hydrogen. But in the infrastructure, there's more to that. There's means of transporting and then also maybe storing hydrogen um, via pipelines, via ships to bring it to your customer in the end. There is, of course, talk about fitting, changing, retrofitting existing infrastructure like gas pipelines for transport of hydrogen or then ammonia in the end when it's transformed. Um, but this is still a way to go. There's studies being done, certainly. But to do this in a technically safe way, that is still quite a stretch. And um, to me, it really needs to be shown how much effort that actually then is to make these steps, and also then how risky that still is in the end. Yeah, to have these existing things and then turning into something completely different then in the end.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what we talked so far is purely the production costs of hydrogen if you want to generate it via green measures or blue measures. Now, obviously, if you're producing the hydrogen in a different country, let's take Saudi Arabia because we had the example, and you want to bring it to Europe, there are processes or steps you need to take in between. So let's take the example. We're going to produce the hydrogen in Saudi Arabia. To transport it to Europe, you need to build infrastructure, namely pipelines. You need to have ships in place on both sides, both in Saudi Arabia and also then to distribute it in Europe. Another important step, usually for this kind of processes, is that you need to convert the hydrogen to ammonia. So usually to transport it from Saudi Arabia to Europe, you need to convert it to ammonia. Why is that? Because hydrogen in itself is very difficult to transport because you cannot really liquefy it. It has very low temperatures to liquefy it, so it's not really feasible to do it. So usually what's done is you convert it to ammonia, which has a higher energy density than hydrogen itself and can be easily liquefied and easily transported that way. Now, just thinking about this, all these transportation costs, this conversion, the reconversion, then the distribution through all about Europe, this is obviously adding up to the prices. We didn't even touch that point yet. Now, this is big investments that need to be taken, and companies that are willing to produce the hydrogen want to make sure that there is a demand for that hydrogen for a reasonable price because there are heavy investments that are coming up.
So coming now to the final challenges, this is the regulatory environment that we have in Europe and in the countries. So that covers all kinds of areas from certifications to standards that are applied in the technical solutions, where not everything is aligned or harmonized as common rules, so to say. Permitting is also not probably not up to speed, takes some time because also the authorities need to adapt all of these changes at this point in time. And even the definition of the words that we've used before, like low carbon or renewables, are not understood everywhere the same, or like renewables. In some countries, it's also including nuclear, in other countries, not.
So yeah, I mean, the way you express it, to me, it's like hydrogen is not a technical challenge. There's technical solutions available. The main challenges are, first of all, price, and the second is really regulatory. So there needs to be clarity and, to a degree, unification, at least in the European Union, to get a clear frame for demand and in the end also for the supply, to really make sure that there is a stable business case where people understand what's going on and how to work with it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's wrap things up. I think we can conclude that hydrogen definitely is a very interesting energy source for the future. In the long run, green hydrogen is obviously the most desired solution because of its CO2 neutral footprint. But green hydrogen is currently facing a few issues, so to say, or challenges, which are namely the capacity, how much green hydrogen actually can be produced, and namely its high production costs. So as long as there are no technical innovations and solutions for that, blue hydrogen actually might be a very interesting interim solution to cover the hydrogen demand. Nonetheless, independent of the hydrogen color, so to say, there needs to be quite heavy upfront investments that need to be taken to build facilities and infrastructure to distribute the hydrogen or even ship it from another country to Europe, for example.
Yeah. So as I said, it's not really in the end the color, but it's so the right effort and push to bring things forward. So, and that is should not be left completely alone to industry, but it really needs also the initiative from the governments to push things forward, to push the system in the right direction. And maybe fundamentally, as well, as we bring then a new major player into the energy mix, the whole energy system needs to be checked, reviewed, and modified and adjusted into the right direction then in the end.
Yeah, so I think that's it. Hydrogen is definitely a topic people should follow up, and we will definitely be on top of it as well. As usual, it was nice talking with you.
Yeah, thanks also from my side. And yeah, despite all the details we had to get into here, it is a very important topic, and I'm really also curious how this thing will go forward.
Me too. So have a good day.
Have a good day.
With that, we thank you for dialing in today's episode.
I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. Maybe it gave you something to think about. Maybe you agree, you disagree. Let us know.
If you enjoyed today's episode, feel free to share it with your friends or colleagues or tag us on social media.
You can find us on MND Consult. That is mnd-consult.com.
And if you have a topic you would like us to unpack or a story you would like to share, feel free to reach out.
So take care and remember,
Shift happens.